On to the next step in the perpetual journey that freedom is tramping through America, and it's the New Deal, set roughly in the early 1930s. The architect of the New Deal is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That name sounds familiar because we studied Teddy Roosevelt. Is there a connection? Yes, they were cousins. Franklin Roosevelt was president from 1933 to 1945 when he died. So as we try to figure out how the New Deal is new, recall that the Square Deal was intentionally limited, right? It was like, we're not going to let anybody tamper with this deck of cards and look at the cards and deal themselves the good ones and other people the bad ones, but we're also not going to redistribute the cards in any way either to make sure people get certain hands over others. And, the New Deal is, as it were, literally a new deal, or sort of an option if you want to stick with the card metaphor of, you don't have a hand that you can play, you can turn that hand in and get a pre-made hand that is at least minimally playable. The New Deal is a response to unprecedented problems in the United States economy and in the social life of the United States. It's a response to what's been known since as the Great Depression, which sort of was inaugurated in the stock market crash of 1929. But it wasn't just the crash. It was sort of an economy that was a house of cards, if you will, and the crash showed how unstable the prosperity of the 20s was, and how much of it was built on just radically escalating debt that was fueling the economy rather than actual work. And so just to give you a sense of how bad things were, the average income of a worker fell by 40% in 3 years. So imagine your parents', salary getting cut by 40%. It's pretty nasty. Unemployment rose into the 20s, and underemployment rose into the 50s because some people had jobs technically, but they weren't full-time jobs. Farmers were hit so hard, so severely, and the banks were calling in their loans, and that they couldn't even harvest their crops because that takes money to get out there and rent the machines to harvest. And so a lot of the crops were just rotting in the fields, even while people starved. So we had people starving in America. It's tough to imagine, but yeah, that was the reality in the 30s. There's shanty towns, these like homeless villages were just popped up all over the country, including in Washington, D.C. And, middle class people who are middle class in 1928 are in shanty towns in 1932. And it was really a nightmare, and people were stunned and they felt terrible. As we've talked about, how much value there is for adults in good work and doing good work well. It's just incredibly frustrating and debilitating for men to not have good work, especially if they've had good work and they lose it. And they want to work, but there's just simply no jobs. What are you supposed to do? So the economy and the country were in terrible, terrible straits. The sidebar here, you've got Thomas Jefferson sort of smirking in his grave at this depression, because remember, Thomas Jefferson thought the United States should be just an incredible extended web of more or less independent farms who traded minimally with each other for some of the goods that they couldn't produce on their own. But he saw the havoc that was potential when you get people that produce one thing and rely on all these other people and international economies in order to make sure all the other stuff that they need in their lives, can be had at a decent price. And so, this depression is exactly what his whole way of structuring American life, or his hope for how American life would be structured. The depression is just like the absolute nightmare of the opposite way, that the country went off in a completely different direction, a very industrial direction. And so again, just want to point that out about what's at stake, and there's trade-offs for the kind of economy that we enjoy. Here is just one out of thousands of examples of a sidewalk completely packed with people who are waiting in line to get their money out of banks and just hoping that it's still there, and because if the bank back then, if the bank went belly up, you lose all your deposits, and who knows what that bank had their money in, maybe stocks, and there just wasn't much regulation of any of that. So you had just all these people worried, and all these people on the brink of ruin, even if they had saved and saved and saved and done all the right things, they could still get wiped out by things completely outside of their control. And we're not going to spend too much time on this, but you shouldn't get the sense that there was just sort of this one Great Depression in the history of the United States. They happened fairly regularly. I mean, this was a severe one in the 30s and early 40s. It was severe, more severe than most. But these sort of boom and bust cycles dominate capitalist life, and it's hard for us to imagine how many people in the 30s really thought, wow, capitalism just doesn't work. Look at what keeps happening. There's just this, these bubbles, asset bubbles happen, and they collapse, and the whole economy is thrown into a loop, and people go hungry, and they lose their savings, and this is terrible. And they were really looking to socialism as a way that might be better. The data was still out, and nobody really knew how bad things were in the Soviet Union. And anyway, that's a complicated discussion. It's beyond what we're going to work on here. But anyway, these are relatively regular occurrences in capitalist economies, these depressions. And one of the striking things about the Great Depression, which we already alluded to, was just these were like people you knew, like let's say, your best friend's parents lose their jobs, and there just aren't any other jobs for them to do. And so they have savings, but they, 1 year goes by, 2 years go by, 3 years go by, and, look what happened. There's still no work, and now their savings are gone, and they've tapped out their relatives who don't have anything either, and they lose their house. And where are they going to go live? Like that was the thing about the Great Depression. These weren't just sort of poor people that sort of you're accustomed to seeing as poor, and you're just sort of like assume, oh, that's just the way that is. These were people like everybody knew, like people knew people who were living in boxes, and that is like really unprecedented in American history, and so that's why we're studying it as we are. So we said that the New Deal is a response to the Depression, and let's just talk through briefly what we'll call the vicious circle of Depression logic. Okay, so imagine you're a business owner, and because demand for your products and services is going down, it would be natural for you, right, to reduce your business capacity. Does that make sense? You don't want to lose money, you don't want to have overcapacity, so you cut back, right? You reduce capacity in order to match your capacity with demand for your business's products and services. So by reducing capacity, you lay off some workers or cut back on worker hours, and or delay purchasing new machinery or supplies to run your business, which in turn, right, causes other effects, because now these workers have been laid off, so they don't get paychecks, so they can't spend money. And the reduced hour workers, they have less money to spend, and you don't buy other firms' products for your business, so they don't sell those products, so their revenue goes down. And so the economy takes a hit, right? Because you and all these other businesses are pulling back at a time that the economy is already terrible, which just makes the economy get worse, right? So now the economy gets worse and demand goes down more. So what do? What is sort of rational for you to do? If you're just looking at this from your own business's, profit, you pull back again, you lay off some more workers, you cut some more hours, you hold off even longer on replacing old machines and things like that. And this just keeps happening, right? Sort of depression logic. So again, here are some pictures of the shanty town in the upper right. And just this is the way a lot of kids lived, in terrible poverty for a decade. There's kids like this all over the place. And, if you saw kids like that walking around on your way to school, you would freak out. And they were all over the place. That's how bad it was. So let's look at what Roosevelt's idea involved, right? Which we might call virtuous circle intervention logic. So you've got private sector demand is low and dropping. Private sector vicious circle logic that we just talked about applies and is bringing everything down. It's just getting worse and worse instead of getting better. And if you just follow the logic of depression logic, why would it ever get better? Demand keeps falling. You keep cutting back your business to match falling demand. Demand falls more. You cut back more. Demand falls more. You cut back more. And so the idea was massive government intervention, putting people back to work, making up jobs for people to have, right? And giving people who are retired Social Security. So now look, workers and retirees have money to spend. Because they're spending money, businesses have rising demand. As businesses have rising demand, they hire more people and give more hours and start buying stuff to run their businesses, which boosts all this extra money out there because now there's more workers who actually have spending money. And as the economy improves and these workers get hired and businesses start hiring again, gradually these people who had jobs the government invented to get the economy going again transition over back to the private sector. And in the meantime, if the government played its cards right and had the right ideas, a lot of neat stuff got built. Canals, roads, bridges, buildings, forests, that all of these millions of people who were getting government jobs were actually busy building during this time. So the issue with this is that it requires an incredible amount of spending on the front end to employ all these people who are unemployed. And that means one of two things. Either you're going to have to raise taxes to do that, and that would necessarily fall on the rich in this case because they're the ones who actually have money, and or you're going to have to borrow an incredible amount of money, which eventually would lead to inflation. And so you have a lot of angry wealthy people who don't like this idea, right? And who are still sort of in that mode of, yeah, these things happen and poor people should just ride this out and it'll get better and don't interfere with the market. Nobody knows better than the market, and let the invisible hand settle this. So there was this big debate, like, should we do this or should we not? And like Teddy Roosevelt, he took a lot of heat for the Square deal from wealthy people who were like, hey, why are you why are you stopping the gravy train here? And he was called a traitor to his class 'cause from a very wealthy family. Well, the Roosevelts these are the same Roosevelt family, really just a different branch of it, and they're very wealthy too. And Franklin was really called a traitor to his class. Wealthy people were like, "What are you doing, Franklin?" And so the question is really who's in the in group, right? So an in group. If somebody's in your in-group and they struggle, well, if they're actually in your in-group, you feel responsible for them and you use your own resources to help them. That's sort of the definition of an in-group. Now the question is, what if Americans falter? Do other Americans through the government rise to the occasion and help them? Like, do Americans form an in-group with other Americans? Or do we just happen to all live in the same country, right? And then or what is the in-group, right? Is it a state? Is it a town, a school, a church, a club, a family, an individual? What's the appropriate size of an in-group? That question's in the air as they try to figure out, should they have this intervention or not? And so, in a sense, what happens is that the answer is yes. Americans have responsibility to other Americans, that Americans form an in-group. And the idea is to have a sort of basic safety net so that any faltering American who can't make it on his or her own is going to at least survive and have a kind of basic safety net in order to get his or her bearings and if conditions work out, to go back forward into life. So the New Deal goes forward and the intervention begins. And let's just look at a handful of the many, many programs that were introduced. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, was founded, and they exist. That exists till to this day, which tries to regulate and keep corruption on Wall Street down to a minimum. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, very important agency, still exists today. So whereas before, at that time, you have money in the bank goes belly up, you lose all your savings. The FDIC, I think today it's $250,000. Your safe your savings account money is secured for up to $250,000, maybe even more by now. I haven't checked recently, but that prevents people from being wiped out if your bank goes belly up. And then this series of groups, and there's even more than these. These are the big ones: the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Public Works Administration, so the CCC, the PWA, the CWA, the WPA. These were the agencies that employed people to build buildings, build canals, dredge ports, build railroads, like anything the country needed. Really, these people were set to work. They planted trees where they had been cut down, like all this stuff, you name it, they were doing it. And so this put millions and millions and millions of people back to work. The Rural Electrification Administration, that was bringing electricity to rural areas in the United States, most of which did not have any electricity before the New Deal. The Tennessee Valley Authority built all these dams and created a major system for power generation in the Tennessee Valley, a relatively poor area of the country. The Social Security Act, which sort of guaranteed retirees a kind of minimal income again. Sort of this is a key foundation of the safety net. And the Wagner Act, which was a way to keep employers and businesses from getting around the laws that allow people to organize unions and workers to organize unions. And so these were a bunch of the programs. So these organizations, the WPA was, the biggest of them all, and I think lasted the longest of that whole group. They did some incredible things. I mean, they built the Golden Gate Bridge. They built the Chrysler Building. They helped build the Empire State Building. Just so many roads. It's an amazing amount of work that got done. I'm sure it was not the most efficient way to do it, but there were definitely all sorts of infrastructure improvements that were really important to the country afterwards. And again, these guys were paid very low wages to do this, and the government borrowed money at very low rates because in depressions, interest rates go close to zero. And so, the economic benefits of this in the short run and in the medium run were fairly substantial. Give you some sense of Franklin Roosevelt. I don't know how much you know about him. He developed polio at the age of 39, which is really, really late to get polio back in that time. It was a big problem back in that time, but usually you got it when you were a kid. So here he is, this vigorous, athletic man, and one day after jogging back with his family from the beach for racing people home, and he felt terrible and went to bed, and when he got up, he couldn't stand up, and he never stood up again. That's how fast it happened. Never stood up on his own without assistance again in his life. And so you got to think about what that would mean for a young, healthy, athletic, successful, prominent person to be sort of paralyzed from the waist down, more or less, and have to wear these unbelievably heavy and uncomfortable braces for the rest of your life, and be assisted every time you stood up and every time you sat down, and to need help walking everywhere. I mean, imagine you're 39 and this all just comes crashing down on you, and how would you deal with that? We've talked about growth mindset before, and we're going to talk about it more. I don't know if there's a better example of growth mindset in the United States. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people tied at the top, but I think Franklin Roosevelt has to be right up there. He's got polio at 39. He's never going to walk again. How easy would it be to feel self-pity, shut down? Instead, you know what? He decides to run for president with polio. And he's got, a couple famous lines that are indicative of his whole attitude. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. The fear of failure is what's paralyzing us, not paralysis. Interesting. And as he put it, right, it is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another, but above all, try something. That's from his inaugural address. As he's explaining, we're going to try to fix this problem. Some of it'll work, some of it won't work, and we'll fix what doesn't work, and we'll just keep trying, right? So this willingness to fail, right? This admitting failure, but not granting that failure is crippling. You just do something else. You try something else, and it's just overwhelmingly powerful mindset, right? Oh, I have polio. He vowed, I will never use this as an excuse in my life, right? I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to make it a centerpiece of conversation. I'm going to use it to strengthen my will. What an incredible decision. What an incredible attitude. And the results were epic. So try to think about empathy and compassion here. This guy who ends up being one of the most empathetic and compassionate presidents in history, perhaps the most, right up there with Lincoln. He travels around the country and he meets all these people, right, who are struggling with the Depression. And, here he has had this debilitating problem. So this guy knows, right, that he can't even get up without help. He can't go to bed without help. He can't go to the bathroom without help. He can't walk across a room without help. So he's utterly dependent on other people. And he realizes we're all dependent on each other. And so when the whole country is struggling, the country needs to band together to help everybody, right? And just to see how that plays out from his own personal experience into an attitude for the whole country. And again, he gets elected again and again and again. He serves 4 terms, which was incredible. So we return to the theme for the history side of the course, A Tramp, A Perpetual Journey, and think through, again, the founding of the country and this incredibly bold declaration that all men are created equal and have the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so, again, we declare our independence from kings in 1776. We add the Bill of Rights in 1791 to prevent the tyranny of the majority. We enfranchise black people in 1860s. We start making national parks in the 1880s and follow that through for decades, so that everybody has a right to enjoy the natural majesty of the country. We have the Square Deal in 1905 that says, not only are we not tools of kings and queens, we're not tools of the people who run the trusts and monopolies here in the United States. We also have the right to safe food and safe workplaces and safe products. In 1920, we get the women's right to vote, so women are enfranchised. 1924, Native Americans are enfranchised, and now we have another step on the journey, right? That people have their own inherent value and have a right to the special protections of children, living wage for their work, and sustaining care after they're no longer able to work and during times of national emergency. And so we've added this enfranchisement and this set of rights to what it means to be an American. Some questions to try to think this through. So everybody has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But can people pursue life, liberty, and pursuit of and happiness if economic forces beyond their control bring depressions to the country? What if you can't work? What if there are simply no private sector jobs? So is this right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is that contingent on there being a favorable economy or not? Is it a natural right, or does it just it just happens to exist if economic conditions are right? And again, Franklin Roosevelt's like, it's a natural right, so the country needs to step up and make sure that people have this minimal safety net so that they can pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Okay, now let's focus on the equality issue, right? If one child's born into safety, physical and ethical health, excellent education, material abundance, and another child is born into danger, physical and ethical illness, poor education, and material poverty, can these two children be said to be created equal? All men are created equal. Or are those guys created equal? So we get back to this issue, is a square deal enough, where you just make sure that the deck gets dealt the way it comes out of the package? Or is that whole metaphor wrong because it never comes out of a package? It always has a history. And again, the Cherokee child on the reservation in Oklahoma, that deck was stacked against that kid, right? So is the Square Deal idea adequate, or do you need the New Deal? And that's sort of a big issue in American politics today. Square Deal would be roughly Republican by today's standards, and the New Deal would be roughly Democratic by by today's standards. And so let's not forget about moral hazard in this whole discussion. Ought we to have a social safety net, employment insurance, unemployment insurance, health insurance, public education, food stamps? Ought those who have faltered get minimal public assistance so that they aren't lost to the world? And then, so it seems like yes, right? I think Roosevelt's answer is yes, and certainly the people living through the Depression were like, what, we want to work, like we don't want this to happen. This is not our fault, and we're just being crushed by this, and we need help. And the decision was made to give that help. But then, what happens when the Depression goes away and those policies are still there? What happens then? And does guaranteeing a minimal safety net addict some people to public assistance who might never then know, the internal goods of responsible good work? And what's the solution to this whole problem? So so here's a kid, right? And there's a kid who's struggling and a kid whose parents didn't do well by the kid and whose situation is terrible. So what happens if we intervene to try to take out of play the effectiveness of parents in the raising of children? Because we don't want that to be a factor in the child's development, right? We want every child to have a great opportunity to thrive, right? And to succeed or fail on his own merits. But by doing that, right, then you take away the responsibility of a parent, right, to provide for the kid. So now somebody else is going to do that, so why would you have to do it? And of course, some people, it wouldn't matter. They would just go ahead and be good parents anyway, but on the margin, some people aren't going to. The results of life show. And so it's a very tricky issue. But getting it right is extraordinarily important for the people of our country. So let's give it some thought. Consider, this sort of political question or any other political or ethical question. We want your decision to be informed by empathy and compassion. We want, if public assistance is actually not in somebody's interest, then, they shouldn't get it. But that should be the basis of the decision, right? It's like that you're actually out for their good and you're not just denying them something because you don't want to give it to them, because you don't count them as somebody who counts. And so, again, I want you to think about this a lot. Who is in your in-group right now? For whom would you intervene if they faltered? You'd intervene for yourself? Probably your family, your friends, your classmates, some of them, all of them, neighborhood, your ethnicity, your city, state, country, all human beings, all living beings. Where are you on that, right? How small is your in-group? And are you taking action to increase it? Because we want you to see, right, that so much of the value of your life and the meaning of your life as a man is going to hinge on, can you take care of your people, and how many people do you take care of? Those are two huge questions. And so you have to have the skills, and the more people, the better. The bigger a person you'll be and the more satisfaction you'll have in your life. And so if you have a small in-group, you should be pushing, no matter what, you should be pushing the limits of your in-group outward. How many more people can you take under your wing and look out for them? The skills you're going to learn in doing that are going to help you so much in your life, because that's what you're going to do as a man at work and at home and with your adult friends and in your communities. You're going to need to care for people. And so have you ever thought about this? Can you make a strong case for why your in-group is the way it is, right? Can you do that? Have you ever thought about it? We need you to be able to, right? As an example, there's almost certainly some sixth grader at our school right now, or a seventh grader at our school right now, who dreads coming to school because there's kids who pick on him all the time. He doesn't know how to deal with it. He doesn't know what to do about it. Can't stop it. Is that kid in your in-group? Do you care at all about that kid? Would you intervene to stop that if you knew about it? Or is that kid not in your in-group, so he just doesn't count, so too bad for him? And then, like, are you aware that, there's entire 8th grade classes practically at some public schools in the city of Dallas that are 2 or 3 grade levels behind in English and math. And when they graduate high school, if they graduate high school, they're not going to be ready even to go to junior college. And try to imagine what that life would be like. Like, does that bother you? Or are those like other kids and they're not in your in-group, so who cares, right? Or do you at some level wish that you could help those people? And you might want to devote your life to getting in a position to being able to help those people. So again, we're just asking you always empathy, compassion. Can you care for more people better? Because it's a key to your life as a man. And Franklin Roosevelt is a great example of somebody who had extraordinary empathy and compassion, growth mindset, overcome every obstacle, and try to lead the country out of its worst economic period in its history.